Welcome, everybody. I'd like to give you a brief introduction to today's event. I'm trying to keep it brief so we have enough time for it's really interesting today. Well, there are many current developments, and that's why we decided on having this event today titled Threats to Democracy and Human Rights. We are all aware that there were many elections in 2024 in Germany, Europe, and globally, and they showed that the boundaries of what can be said are shifting, that there are more inhumane ideologies and right-wing initiatives, especially. There are current legislative plans and discussions on a local, national, and international level that underline these developments. Those challenges are nothing new, but they seem to be becoming more numerous. We don't want to talk about a gloomy past, future only, but would like to talk about strategies and options for educational practice, because there are successful answers to these kinds of challenges. We have an agenda for today. Dilan, if you could share it in the chat. There are three blocks to it. We'll start with the first one right away, with an impulse from Ibrahim Arslan, and he's going to talk to Ceren Türkmen. I'm very happy that Mr. Arslan is here today. He is a survivor of the racist arson attack from November 1992 in Mölln, and he encourages other victims to speak. He goes to schools and talks about his experience, and he makes workshops. Then we'll have a brief break, and after that, a panel discussion with our awareness team, our organizers, and critical friends of our project. We'd like to take a look at further challenges linked to more topics of transformation, such as AI, climate change, or the options of inclusive, decolonial, and discrimination critical educational work. There will be a part we record and another one where we'll stop the recording so that you can speak freely when the floor is yours. After the lunch break, you'll have another opportunity to be part of very exciting and interesting workshops.
I'd like to now introduce Ceren Türkmen, our moderator, sociologist, works as at the Center for Memory Democracy in Duisburg. She's worked for anti-racism human rights activists for many years, and she is active in Berlin. So when it comes to remembrance, democracy, human rights, she's the person for that, and that's a very good point where we can hand it over to our moderator, and we're very, very grateful to have Tim with us for the expertise that she will share. Thank you, Sandra. I'm really happy to be here today, particularly because it's the last event. It's a very important event in this project. As you can see, we're dealing with difficult political times. And, it's really nice to end this whole project with just a little bit of energy of power, empowerment, good energy, so that we can take that into the next year. All right. Welcome. I went to a lot of the events within this project, so I'm very passionate about this topic, obviously. And I'd like to thank Ibrahim Arslan for coming today. So thank you very much for finding the time to be with us. I'd just like to tell you what we're going to do in the next 1.5 hours. This is our first block of today. Ibrahim Arslan will speak to us first. He'll speak for 15 minutes. And then I'm going to go into a discussion with him. This will take about 20 minutes or so. Afterwards, we're going to open up the floor to all of you, to the plenary. And then we're very much looking forward to answering your questions. Afterwards, we'll be taking a 15-minute break. So that will be the plan for this morning. Now I'd like to introduce Ibrahim Arslan. I'm sure all of you know him. He's done amazing work for many years. He has experienced this racist right extremism fire in he was able to save himself, but unfortunately, his sister, his cousin, grandmother perished. Ibrahim has been working as an anti-racist messenger for in our democracy. He is a leader when it comes to tolerance, works in anti-racism, on anti-racism measures in schools. Last year, he won the Human Rights Award of the Pro Azil Foundation. So welcome. Also, I just want to say every year he gives a speech, and the speech is in memoriam of those who lost their lives in this horrible event that took place with the fire. All right. So we're really much looking to speaking with you when it comes to education, human rights education. And now I'd like to hand it directly over to you so we can hear directly from your mouth. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I can't really add anything because you said everything about me, so I can't really say anything else about myself. But thank you very much to everybody who's showed up today. I think it's amazing that so many people came so early in the morning, got up so early to be here so that they could be involved in our discussions. Thank you very much for that. And I'd also like to thank the interpreters for the work that they are doing. I am incredibly inspired that everything is working so well when it comes to the interpretation. I've learned also a lot. And I think it's really, really great that the technology is able to offer this. So I am Ibrahim Arslan. As Ceren said, I'm not only someone who has, experienced racism, but I'm also an activist and I'm an educator. And I've been doing educational work since 2007. So I do it with respect to people who have been affected by racism. I try to empower them so that they can share their perspectives, not only with society, but also to themselves. And, we empower these individuals to be in schools. I go to schools, get into contact with students so I can change certain narratives within the schools. And, it's really, really important to really hear from the perspective of those who are being affected, as opposed to always focusing on the perpetrators. So I do activism, like that's my work. And, something that I work on is a speech that takes place in the city of Mölln every year. We've been doing this since 2013. And now this speech has become a part of the Mölle Memoriam Day. But then later, this was taken out of the official program of this Memoriam Day. And that's why we made our own event for this. And we're using this as a platform for all those who have been, affected by racist violence, so that they can share their stories with society. And at the same time, they can stand up together with those who have been affected to empower and encourage everyone to stand up against racism in Germany altogether and encourage people in different cities to stand up and do the same as a sort of chain. And, that's just to encourage people to continue to work on this topic, to bring awareness to this topic within society. So with respect to this memoriam event that we have, we're really focusing on the perspectives of those affected and without the perspectives of these people. And it wouldn't be what it is now, but we're working together with the institutions as well in Mölln. And so we're really trying to be pioneers of a new culture of paying tribute to those affected by racism. We're also offering other events in parallel to the events that are being offered in Mölln with respect to this event, with respect to also federal events. We're working together with, like I said, lots of people who have been affected by racism, who are, organizing similar events in their respective cities. Since 2012, we have put a lot of effort into a project and we're trying to, network those affected by racism. We're trying to empower them, bring them into contact with one another. For 2 years now, we've created social network that meets on federal level for those who have been affected by racism. And these people come together to talk about, uh, yeah, memoriam perspectives when it comes like how we can pay tribute to their plights within society. This is something that is spoken about, and there's a network that has been created for this, or an alliance, so to speak. And this alliance is there to support these people, but also at the same time to, generate new thoughts when it comes to how we can pay tribute as a society to these events in a new and an innovative way. Well, that's all that I can say at this juncture, but I would like to now open it up to Ceren to ask her questions to me. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sure much went in one ear and out the other, but I hope that we can, yeah, re-stimulate everything once we get into the discussion again. I just wanted to say one thing. Everything that I just said, um, everything that I'm doing is I'm doing on a voluntary basis. That's something that I wanted to talk about today. Should this type of work be done always on a voluntary basis? And that's keeping into account the fact that those affected by this have to put a lot of effort into even just talking about it. Well, thank you very much, Ibrahim, for your remarks. I appreciate them very much. First of all, I just have, or rather, a request. Could you perhaps share with us what led to you becoming an activist? Normally, for those affected by racism, a decision needs to be made after a very, very long process of, yeah, dealing with what happened. So when did you decide to be an activist? At what point did this take place? Since so you saved your life, and then there was an attack in your home on the 23rd of November, and that was the 22nd anniversary of this event, and that must have stirred up a bunch of feelings for you. So what led to you becoming an activist? That's just basically my question. And what was really the final point where you decided I'm going to get involved? Well, thanks a lot for the question. I don't want to generalize things here, and I don't, but just because I'm not the only person who decided to be an activist. There's many people who have decided that, but I can only speak about myself. Well, we people of color at schools, we have to be active in a racist society. So we have to defend ourselves, and in us defending ourselves, we're already being activists, and that's something that it's really important to consider. So then we have to take our experience and go into society, and that is a form of activism, so to speak. But when it comes to my active political work, I started this in 2007. I no noticed that this memoriam event was taking place in Mölln from the perspective of the institutions and not necessarily from the perspective of those affected. And I also noticed that when it comes to the broader society, it's much easier to just forget what happened as opposed to really, really dealing with and, chewing on the perspectives of those affected because maybe that's harder. People aren't asking themselves the question how we can support these people. And that's something that really um, gave me a motivation to, hold society accountable for what happened. Because after this attack, there was a second attack. And rather the second attack is that society doesn't do anything. And so that's why I step forward to, deal with society, deal with schools, deal with media. So to talk about how we can deal with what happened from the perspective of those affected. So we are those that are affected by these acts, and we have to ask ourselves what it means. to be, affected by not only the first attack, but also the second attack that takes place within society. And then I also want to ask ourselves, well, d these types of events only happen in Mölln, and unfortunately, it happens in different cities. And in these different cities, there were memoriam events. You know, for example, when it comes to dealing with the Holocaust, and oftentimes we see at these events those affected by the Holocaust are kind of used as objects, to look at, but rather we're not really hearing from them in a participatory way in terms of hearing about their perspectives. So that's why I wanted to change the narrative when it comes to storytelling about these events. And at the same time, I wanted to bring those affected by racism to the fore so that society can reflect together with these people when it comes to developing a new way of paying tribute in memoriam to the events that took place. And that's what I said in my introductory statements as well. And that's why I created this network group as well for those affected by racism. It's a federal network group. And in this network group, we talk about our experiences. And we are very, very convinced that this alliance is a good thing because together we have one shared voice that we bring out to society. And we don't want the institutions to take over the leadership of this memoriam culture. We want to be actively involved, and this is something that we are trying to encourage. That's why we're trying to empower and motivate everybody within this network. Okay, so in our time, some Beispiel, for example, when the attacks took place, there weren't any psychological consultation centers that we could go to get help. There weren't any funds in place to give those affected by racism any type of compensation. There wasn't anybody there to help us with the trauma that we experienced afterwards, because that was quite a long time ago. And this is something that we had to do ourselves. And in doing so, we learned a lot. And so, we experienced quite a lot. And in doing so, we, helped each other. We helped give each other psychological support. We recommended lawyers to these people. We recommended doctors to these people because the state wasn't there doing that for us at the time. So we became experts, so to speak, when it comes to support, self-support. And that's why we sort of became a strong network as an unofficial institution, so to speak. When it comes to educational system, I really try to be active there. And I really want to create a pillar there. And I went to schools and I noticed that there's a really high need when it comes to students, when it comes to pupils. There's a real gap when it comes to the educational system where, those affected by racism aren't being brought to the fore to learn from them. And this is something that I would like to change. Well, you brought up forward a lot of very concerning points. So you said that in 2007 you became active, and you did this because you noticed that the memoriam culture, when it comes to the fire that you affected, wasn't something that was taking place in consultation with those really affected. So you're becoming active not only to, generate awareness amongst society, but also amongst peoples in school. And, as you said, this memoriam culture is part of political education as well. And this is a discrepancy that you're seeing that this isn't really taking place. So you want to really empower people and you want to talk about racism, of course. I think it's really interesting that you said, in the early 2000s and in the 90s as well, when you in 1992, when the fire in Mölln took place, you were 7 years old. I was 11 years old. And I can really remember amongst my friends that we really knew what took place in Mölln and Solingen and Hungze in other cities. We knew about that. I also remember seeing you in the media, and you represented a whole generation of people in the East and the West. And I come from West Germany. We sort of recognized that we didn't have the same rights, that we couldn't participate, that we weren't protected by we didn't have anti-discrimination laws that protected us in society and in school. And so I think it is um, very great that you started speaking about this in the early 2000s, because in the 90s, this isn't something that wasn't being spoken about, very actively. There were these attacks in the 90s, but unfortunately, racism wasn't really the focus of the discussions that took place afterwards. And that should have been the focus, institutional racism, and talking about that. Now, I have another question. Mm, we can maybe like take a look at the speech that took place in Mölln. Every year you select different topics that are going to be the focus of these events. And I'm interested to hear about which focal points you selected for this year's speech. Can you tell us about this year's event, what you focused on? Perhaps talk to us about the day and talk about the day in general. So how this year's event went, and just about this memoriam event in general.
Yeah, I just thought about whether things have changed, whether we actually talk about racism right now, today. And I see that history is repeating itself. We often talk about the word racism and but don't talk about racist violence. I mean, there are reasons we are living in a capitalist society, and that's why many acts are not seen as racist or as terrorist acts. And this is a whole different way of approaching this. This is another discriminating way of approaching this, talking about victims. Duisburg, 1984, the murder on Boris Ogdat, and many others. There were racist motives, but nobody talked about those. Those were precluded, and people are still fighting for some kind of reparation, for a recognition of what this attack actually was. And that's what I wanted to talk about first and foremost. I don't think that things have changed as compared to the 90s, but there is one thing. Namely, we have this shift of narrative regarding the commemoration and how to work with the victims, those affected. And that's what I'd like to emphasize. It was those affected, the victims, that really created this kind of movement. And we can see that with the Mölln speech. It is not a commemorative event anymore, it is a political event, an important event to also, well, implore the way that these events are handled from a societal point of view. And that has also led to many politicians calling us, asking us how to really make commemorative events more dignified. And that is a turning point in how to deal with history. This switch from how it was before to how it is now. We are, and I can say that proudly, we are pioneers for a new way of commemorating these events. And we have to do more in that regard because it's so important. I mean, there are politicians calling us. I mean, it's still shameful that they haven't learned, but at least they are asking us. They're trying to implement things we tell them to, things we recommend. So this is a major feat, actually. We have an institution, the city of Mölln, that accepted that they can only make these events a success with us. And that's what happened this year. We made this joint commemorative event, independent of the Möllner speech. It has become a kind of platform, this speech. Anyone can use this platform to talk about their experiences with violence and discrimination, with many people participating in that event, and we call on others to show solidarity to those who are brave enough to talk about their experiences. We have those affected, we have victims that people don't know about. Last year, during the speech, we had Fatma Ceylan, and she was there for the very first time. She became a victim of a package bomb attack just a short time after the Mölln attacks. And last year was her first time speaking there. And now we've been invited to her very first commemorative event, which is going to take place on the 22nd of December this year, the first event that she has organized. So that means our events can motivate others and empower others to really support those affected, those victims that have not been supported as of yet. And it's so important that we open doors for exactly these people. We don't only want to tell our story because that wouldn't be enough, that would be too simple. We want to challenge the societal approach. And that's what makes the Mölln speech, the Möllner Rede, what it is. It is a way of showing the cities or others what we should do. This year in Mannheim, we talked about Schönau, what has been forgotten, what happened, these horrible deeds in Schönau. And we call upon the state institutions to really follow up, to finally recognize these deeds as terrorist attacks, which is, or racist attacks, which is what they were. Yes, you mentioned it before. You were in Mannheim at the City Theatre this year, yes? Yes, we were at the City Theatre in Mannheim, and together we cooperated with a theatre to organize the Mölln speech. There were other actors present from Mannheim, others involved in the organization. You probably won't find it online, I'm afraid. Unfortunately, it was taken off YouTube, so at the moment you won't find it there. We will re-upload it, but there are some technical issues, and that's why we had to take it down. But we'll re-upload it again. You will find it, but the Cologne, Berlin speeches, you'll find all of them on YouTube. Yes, you mentioned something, a serious issue, a great challenge. And it's a challenge that you and your network are working on, namely being recognized. Thanks to many critical researchers, journalists, and victims, we were able to find some or to collect some figures on the gap between those affected by racist, anti-Semitic attacks and the figures that the statistical offices have. And that has been criticized a lot as being a systemic failure. And that's what you also claim. There is this gap which leads to further ignorance. And there's a lack of consequence, or there are consequences for the victims. And there are also social, societal consequences. There needs to be more done in with regards to dealing with racist, anti-Semitic, etc. attacks. You started working on that in 2007, 2008. You did so, and then the NSU exposed itself, which brought this all up to a greater scale that led to there being a narrative in Germany after the Halle and Hanau attacks. And that is when the narrative changed. And you did all that in your spare time. You connected, you established networks at national level. You worked with researchers, journalists, neighbors, associations, and you found these people supporting you. There's a high degree of solidarity within your network, and you said it. And this is what you did, what you worked on. You fought for recognition because at a civil level, these sentences are often not recognized. And that was your accusation um, towards all these institutions, etc. And all that you've done shows that there are so many different actors that you've worked with, and it has only grown, it has increased. You started going to schools, you work with young people, with adults. And now I wonder, how do you do that? How can you successfully do your work? What are challenges? What are obstacles when trying to really create that national network with those affected, with victims who you find via these maybe psychological social services because they cannot enjoy the rights that they should be able to enjoy? How can you connect that to your political partners, to educational actors, to journalists? Because there are so many different actors involved. How do you do it? Well, it's a fairly easy question to answer. You just ask the victims what they need. And that is something else. This is another shift in a narrative of society. We as a society always think that if there are victims that are linked to violence, that if we ask them, that they are re-traumatized by that. That is an assumption. But that's not what the victims say. No, they want to be asked, they want to tell their stories, and they want to be able to demand things they need. Of course, I admit I was very afraid when in 2012 I wrote my first letters to those affected by the horrible deeds of the NSU. I was afraid of their reaction. I was afraid of them telling me, I don't want to talk. I want to finish that chapter in my life or leave us alone. But it was quite the opposite. These people wanted to connect, they wanted to be part of a network. And that's what I feel is the case for most victims and those affected. They have this major need to connect. And we see that looking at the chronology of the Mölln speech. Each year, there were, of course, members of my family who has worked in that for 20 years now. There are people affected, there are victims who spoke for the very first time after 32 years. My cousin, for example, took the floor the first time after 32 years. And that shows how important our work is, how important it is to recognize these people as what they are, affected victims. And that's so important because only then can we continue with our work. We need to open these doors to those affected, to the victims. They often lose their entire basis, their foundation after such attacks. They often feel impotent, that they can't do anything. I talked about Fatma Ceylan immediately after the attack in 1992, the attack on her and her family. She left the country and then many years later came back because her story was so important for us. It was so important for her to talk about it, to have that attack recognized as a racist attack. So we shouldn't only see ourselves as people telling our stories, talking about history. No, it's important to give others the chance to also tell their story because those affected, the victims, should feel like they can do something, they can be part of this major transformation process. And it's so easy to include those affected because they want to be included. And that's the message I'd like to pass on to you. And that works at a very small scale. If I have students and they start talking about their experience of violence, if they tell their stories to other students, to their friends, And at the same time, we reach teachers. We can call upon teachers and others to really take a closer look at what's happening. And the same goes for groups of victims that I meet nationwide. And these people often tell me, let me help you, let me be part of your work. I mean, it'd be even better to have an institution where victims can actively work on improving the situation, because then they'd see that there are no consequences to their work, to their actions in Germany. Many are afraid, what happens if I share my story? Will the same thing happen to me again? Or what if I criticize the state? Will I lose my status? And those are the fears that we need to take from the people. And we can only manage that if we and other pioneers, other victims can motivate them and encourage them and tell them, here, there won't be negative consequences. I see a great potential in the victims to do that kind of work. In Hanau, this happens amazingly well. Immediately after the attack, the people in Hanau went public and took the floor. After today's event, we should also know that we worked hard to enable them. We made workshops with these people. We worked with those supporting the people in Hanau. They came with us, they worked with us, learned from us, and then created these networks in Hanau. So we should be aware of that too, not only looking at one point, but seeing the entire development. Yes, you've been doing your work for a long, long time, and that means you are aware of the history, the development, and that's what you just talked about. Um, Halle, Hanau, what fortunately happened after these horrible, horrible attacks. A lot has changed in a short span of time. There are many more people talking about racism, right-wing extremism, and anti-Semitism in Germany. And this is a break with a former paradigm. It was a paradigm shift. And that's also what the institutions felt. They were able to talk about racism. You might remember, I certainly remember, it was the first time that the federal chancellor spoke, the first time in the history of right-wing extremism. It was the first time that the chancellor really mentioned the names of the victims from Hanau, that they really called them by their names, which means that the victims were not made invisible. We had we also had the hashtag say their names. I think we all remembered that. And now looking back to the self-exposure of the NSU in 2013, it was a great scandal around NSU. But back then, victims were much too invisible. Even though there was a scandal and an exposure of such a right-wing terrorist organization with a series of murders over many years. But back then, we really had to fight hard to become more visible. And you did exactly that throughout the 2010 decade until the final day of the process in Munich. Um, Halle Hanau, so that was the turning point. From then on, you could talk openly about these kinds of events, so that was a major success. But what about the changes? What changes have there been since 2007? You said that nothing much has changed, but at the same time, things did change. Could you go into greater detail about that? How did the way of speaking about human rights change, especially those affected by racism? How did their way of speaking about human rights change? Well, let me talk about what hasn't changed, how institutions deal with racist violence or how they don't deal with it. In our statements, we often say that if there are persons of colors attacked, killed by people read as white, we first and foremost believe that it is a racist reason for that until we're proven wrong. So we need to really demand that that's the way it is, that we first believe that it was a racist reason why these people were killed. But at the same time, we together found out that as a society, we're not even capable of apologizing to the families. After NSU, there was no social outrage regarding NSU, none from society as a whole. Yes, from a perspective of those affected, nothing has changed looking at the society. In order to really change something, we need a collective solidarity. And I don't see that, to be honest, looking at how we deal with violent attacks for anti-Semitic or racist reasons. There is a shift when it comes to how we deal with those affected and their close ones. Those affected, the victims, they created a large or a great movement. That means our perspective has not changed as to society or the language used after such an attack. No, but the perspective from those affected, from the victims, has changed. We have become much more professional, much more active, and we are included in decision-making processes. And that is something that is thanks to the victims, those affected. It's not thanks to the great solidarity of the state. It is because we demanded it. And that is a great distinction that we have to make. For a few years now, we have a new law on how to compensate the victims, the level of reparations. What if the victims hadn't demanded that? Then, well, nothing much would have changed at the Federal Office for Justice. And that means so those affected, the victims, do so much. They work so hard. Also looking at the individual processes and how they are being dealt with. I can only repeat myself. The language, how we deal with racism in this country, nothing much, hardly anything or nothing has changed. It's still the same. People are still being killed, persecuted. The language towards those coming here, the refugees, is the same, or how we deal with those having fled their countries, or the way we talk about human rights. We should also talk about how people are being treated if they flee to Germany, for example, Syrian, Ukrainian refugees, how we treat them. Those are topics we need to address, and how to deal with racist structures and how they are linked to capitalism. But if we talk about that, I think we won't finish today. So from our perspective, it's very important to keep talking about that. Yes, led, we have created change and we want to be recognized as experts and that we actively work on that. We demand an institution led by victims for victims, and that is highly necessary in order to guarantee further success of our work, in order to change the German narrative regarding commemoration or the treatment of victims.
So when it comes to participation, looking for people to empowering them to, stand up for their rights or reminding them of the rights that they actually have. A lot of victims don't even know what rights they are entitled to. And then you also, helped people use rights to their advantage, to create new rights and also to use the rights that existed. Just to summarize what you said, I remember recommendations that were not legally binding at the time in NSU investigation committees, and in these committees they were doing a lot of professional work, reminding people of, what the different laws were. But a lot of the recommendations that came out of these committees were not legally binding, and this is something that's why these recommendations, or rather, that whole process is heavily criticized. But now I'd like to just move over to a different field, to your political work in schools. So, or when it comes to rather political education, what role does human rights play when it comes to when it comes to political education? Do you really stand behind human rights political education? Is this something that you are dealing with in your work? Will you be focusing this more in the future? Have there been any changes in this regard? Okay, when it comes to my political work, when in education and schools, we speak about human rights, of course, but the topic of human rights, is really the main focus of my work, I have to say. Like, would I be doing this? And why am I doing this on a voluntary basis? Because I think human rights are, incredibly important. As a victim, I want to have as many rights as those who have not been affected by racism. And this is what gave me the motivation to do this work, even though I don't receive any money for this. That's the most important thing for me, standing up for human rights. Otherwise, what am I doing this all for? This is like really the guiding light for my work, I have to say. And I'm not only doing that for me, I'm doing this for others as well. When it comes to educational system, this work is very important. And you can see how important it is when you hear the answers of the pupils once you speak to them. They've never ever experienced people coming to the classrooms and talking about their experiences. And there's differences between those who experienced the Holocaust and us, for example, because we're talking about people, who experience racism on an everyday basis. And people who do experience racism on every day, when we go to these schools and talk about our experiences, they feel seen. They feel they're part of a community within a community, and we remind them of their rights. So for them, for the students, those particularly affected by racism within institutions, within schools, we are there for them. Not only for them, but we are there for them at their side. This work is very important for our school system, and taking into consideration that this is taking place all on a voluntary basis that we're doing, this has to be, seen as sort of a failure of the human rights system. The fact that I'm doing this for free. So for years now, I haven't been receiving any money for the work that I do. So that means that there's a major gap when it comes to the education system. We created a network group, as I said, and we do educational work. And we offer our activism to the schools. And we have also been able to prove that this very important work to be conducted in schools, but this work is not being sought out by some schools. Some schools are seeking us out. They, really want to have us involved. And, some of these schools, depending on, the way the student groups mix are put together, they need us to be there. Um, just to help these students really find their way within our society. And I think that this is really important. It's important for us to go to these schools to tell these peoples what their rights are. It's also important to go to schools where, there's not a lot of victims within the classrooms, but talk about how students shouldn't become part of the problem later in life within society. We don't want people, to grow up to be perpetrators of the exact same problem. So thank you very much just for your point of view when it comes to embedding human rights more in the education system and what more can be done. So it seems like a lot has already been done, and it's just waiting for the institutions to really implement everything, to really, put the momentum behind all this work that you've already created via laws, perhaps via curriculums. Yeah, Sharon Jang, can I just add one thing? We need to consider uh, that the victims are already doing a lot. It would really cool if, for example, within a democratic country, that human rights are taken seriously, that other people would be doing that for us and inviting us to participate in these events. But what's taking place in here in Germany is that we, the victims, are the ones setting everything up. We have a need to talk about what happened. And the victims or new victims need somebody to talk to, and they want to come to us. The institutions aren't offering them the appropriate people to talk to. So that's why it was necessary for us to form an alliance so that new victims have, a group they can look towards for support. All right, so it's 10 past 11 now. I'd like to open up the plenary to the participants for questions.
And that was the recording. In this panel, I'd like to welcome the project team as well as three critical friends. That means we'll have a rather large panel, not much time, but nonetheless, we are committed to discussing together with you, taking a step back, looking back to an exciting time. This project achieved a lot, many projects were designed, workshops, we learned a lot. So in that panel, we'd like to look back to what was done over the past 2 years. We'll have 30 minutes for that, and we'll talk with our panelists, and then we'll have another 30 minutes to talk to all of you. So, welcome to our panelists. We have Josephine Akinyosoye. She is a part of the scientific staff and project coordinator of the project Building Bridges with Human Rights, Political Education and Transformation Processes, and she's working at the German Institute for Human Rights. Then welcome Professor Simone Danz. She is a critical friend of this project and professor for inclusive youth welfare at the Frankfurt University of Applied Sciences. Welcome, Simone. Welcome, Thomas Gill, another critical friend of the project. From the very beginning, he's supported us with his Christmas decorations in the background and head of the Berlin Regional Center for Political Education. It's great to have you. Welcome, Judy Gumisch. There you are, I can see you. Another critical friend of the project and a trainer and educator focusing on human rights, inclusion, and diversity. And last but not least, welcome Sandra Reitz. She works at the staff department for basic questions of human rights, education, and head of the project with Building Bridges with Human Rights, Political Education and Transformation Processes. Okay, you've created this project 2 years ago, and it was designed much earlier. Now, 2.5, 3 years, that's not a long time. But we know that those were 2 long years. A lot has happened, a lot that isn't easy to deal with. And we know that there's a high degree of uncertainty from a political point of view. These challenges are not new, but they have become much more complicated, I believe. And they have become more numerous. I don't want to talk about the individual topics that we have been dealing with for 2 years now at global and national level, but there were also great successes. We just talked about different areas in our impulse just before the break, but your project is another success. And this is our chance now to look back and maybe look into the future as well. My first question, Sandra, what did your project do for the practical work of political education after 2 years of intensive work? What did you achieve? Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction and the questions. I'd like to add something. Dylan Terzi is also part of the project team. Our student that supports us, she's not part of the panel, but she has helped us a lot during these 2 years. When I read your question, I first thought, we're not done yet. There's still a lot to do until we finish this project. But I'd still like to try and answer your question and just think about what we'll have achieved by the end of the year. Well, we want to empower people, we want to strengthen human rights in political education. And well, I hope nobody says differently, but I think we have managed so. We've had 10 interesting events dealing with these kinds of processes and what these transformations mean for political education. And I think we had a great participation, between 50 and 100 participants, depending on the event itself. And we think that we were able to reach many multipliers that help us, well, reach even more people afterwards. And that was kind of a pioneering work. And that's what people told me during the events, that human rights education is kind of a niche. Not many people know what it is. And some of these topics are very recent topics, such as artificial intelligence. So I hope that our events led to people gaining new insights, helped people, well, think about this differently. It was a highly ambitious project. We often said that we don't really have time to go into greater detail when working with these topics, and sometimes we only scratch the surface. We're planning follow-up projects. Maybe Josephine can talk about her follow-up project, Horizons. Of course, we continue working with these topics, dealing with these topics. And to be honest and self-critical, which I am, there was a sub-goal, namely exchanging perspectives on human rights between traditional and new actors in the political education sector, talking with different organizations that we heard about this morning that didn't immediately say, yes, we're working in political education, but rather working in anti-discrimination work, in inclusion, etc. We wanted to reach those people and connect them with the more traditional actors, those who studied political science, for example, and who work with or who work in political education in the more traditional institutions. But that was rather difficult. We thought that it might happen on its own during these events, and well, maybe we just don't know about it, but we felt that it was difficult in these online events. We tried different formats. We had a hybrid event we had that with Thomas Gill, and it was very complicated logistically and from an organizational point of view. We have to think about a cost and effect, cost benefits. And I think that will remain an issue we need to talk about, on how we can try to really break out of our bubbles. I'm speaking from a white perspective, and that might be a completely different bubble from those of persons of colors who need more inclusion, etc. We need to think how we can really exchange our ideas and perspectives better, and to create a greater level of solidarity. I said it before. We have our website and we will publish a lot more. Josephine has said it before. We want to go into greater detail with regards to different topics. We are creating educational material on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from a non-Eurocentrist perspective. That's something we're working on, and I think that's what we do. We have our core results that we make available to the public so we can check that box. And there's another sub goal that we have, namely to make inclusion, participation, discrimination, protection, and other perspectives more visible and to recognize them more. I think we were able to do that and to also accompany that process. So this is a continuing process for us, for the entire institute, but I think we were able to improve that steadily. So another check mark here. But in the Institute, we've had awareness teams for the very first time now, and that was what we wanted as a new standard, that we have somebody there to help people. Yes, that's it.
Thank you very much. Thomas Gill, you are a member of the board of this project, and you are also working in Berlin. You accompanied this project. You're doing this with the federal Bundeszentrale, and this was something that financed this project as well. So this was a very important project for you. What were the ideas behind this project, and where is this project in terms of its implementation? We'd like to hear that. Well, Sandra gave just gave half of my answer, I have to say. But why did I want to be involved in this project? Well, I have to say, on the one hand, I took a look at the international human rights situation at the time, and also saw that, we only have the 1848 declaration in Germany, but we don't have a lot of instruments here in Germany that are current. So we wanted I really wanted to make sure that human rights was a lot more anchored in different structures when it comes to education, society, etc. With respect to, political education, although I have to say human rights are not dealt with enough. Secondly, taking a look at the Human Rights Convention, there was a lot of difficulty when it comes to how the declaration came about, and also with respect to the implementation thereof in the respective countries. So therefore, I thought, when it came to human rights education, that more of a focus was put on this in Germany, and that, we want to talk about the interest, we want to talk about supporting these individuals, or all individuals rather. And this is something that Sandra said. I'm interested in communicating with people. Uh, I'm interested in equality for people. There's a lot of, things that I notice, are not really being done well when it comes to political education. We don't want to talk about what, people are doing to others. We want to talk about um, rights that everybody has. Everybody in this country has rights, the exact same rights as everybody else. And that's something that I really want to focus on. So when it comes to the Critical Friends meetings that we've had, we talked about a lot of different things when it came to this project, reflected on a lot of things. We've had a lot of different events. And I'd like to thank all those who helped us with these events. Thank you to the project teams. But in the events that we had, we, really were able to talk about the main ideas behind this project. And as Sandra was speaking, I was thinking perhaps we need to think about different ways about discussing this topic, and not just at the events that we have, but in a different way, maybe digital events, to be able to have just a discussion about this, to bring more people to the table. In the past 2 years, and this is something that Sandra said as well, we have been working on a lot that's not really, or rather seeing things that aren't new, but really are really saddens us to see, there's a new dynamic when it comes to racism in our country, and this means we need to have more impetus behind political education. Also, on a federal level, we're seeing more pressure being put on this. you know, we're seeing expectations, from society being uh, placed upon us to solve solutions that our current education system cannot solve. And it's something that we are discussing as well within our groups, and which the project is also taking a closer look at. So thanks very much for, bringing up those points. Josephine Akinosoye, what were the topics that you focused on? What was your highlight from this project? Well, thanks for the question. Just to summarize, we had an event, and at this event, we talked about just an overview. Then we talked about educational practices against right-wing extremism. That was the first event. In the 2 years of this project, a lot took place on a political level. A lot of transformations took place. And this is something that we couldn't have expected, but things are continuing and the project is continuing. We see that the current government is changing as well, and there's threats to, political education. We see, we saw this as an opportunity, but also as a challenge to get involved. As Sandra said, we brought a lot of people together through networking, but we also wanted to try and ensure that our panel discussions, our podium discussions were really diverse. We want to show the diversity of our society within these panel discussions. We invited a bunch of different people to our different initiatives. We had an initiative on learning about the NSU complex, for example. We had different panels when it comes to different societal topics. We talked about topics that, have been present in the last 20 years, not necessarily completely new topics, but topics that, are always popping up once again in society. As we heard, we're talking about, memoriam culture, we're talking about political education, traditional political education, empowerment for political education, activism for political education. We want to create some movement here. We wanted to work together with the different personalities working in this realm. With respect to creating a new event online, we're always asking ourselves how many people can come to these events, will come to these events, how many people of the different diverse, parts of society will be represented at these events. This is something that we can perhaps do, better in person, but lots of different states are taking a look at this right now. We have who's going to be doing this education, where the resources are going to come from, if we're going to have, an online event taking place during the week, who will be sponsoring this. These are things to think about. And then we have to ask ourselves if these events were successful, because it's very difficult to assess the successfulness of such events. But the highlight was just really thinking about, different approaches that are not necessarily new to reaching people, but how can we become more visible? How can others become more visible? We had an event when it came to refugees and migration. We talked about, educational practices for when it comes to refugees and migration. What is the goal of these educational practices that we have in place? Who was our target group? We spoke about that. We talked about rights of access for people. We talked about the integration courses that are available for these individuals. you know, we also sort of noticed that perhaps, via our diversity on our panels, we were able to reach more people. We had lots of different people present on our panels, people, from different walks of life, different foundations. We could hear from, people spearheading different initiatives in the human rights realm. When it comes to anti-colonial resistance, for example, we heard from people. We heard about people talking about, yeah, right-wing extremism, people talking about racism within society. And, with these different initiatives that are in place, we were able to see what was successful, what wasn't, learn from others' best practices. It wasn't an easy process to, speak to everybody about the different approaches. There were differences of opinions in our groups that we had. And as Sandra said, sometimes we only really stayed in on the surface level when it came to what we were talking about. Sometimes we'd be working on something for multiple weeks and we just get lost in certain questions. Now, talking about highlights, well, we had an event on the climate, and we had an event with UNESCO on sustainable development. We had a climate activist and educational personality with us. Peter Donatos was speaking as well, and we could hear from people from different perspectives in this regard. We had workshops on climate, decolonial perspectives when it comes to the climate, ableism and climate we heard about as well. We heard about bringing human rights aspects into this transformation process when it comes to the climate change. We also spoke about inclusion, decolonial perspectives when it comes to the climate. We talked about artificial intelligence, as Sandra said, and we had migration events as well. We had an event on post-colonial human rights education. That was a highlight for me when it comes to education, thinking about new forms of education, not just the content, but rather creating spaces to talk about decolonialism in a different way. We had workshops on embodiment, theater, pedagogy. We, heard about perspectives from the global south. In the global south, they don't really use the word term political education. We heard from somebody from Each One Teach One that the Black citizen movements there use different terms. There's, history that it's not new, of course. And perhaps this history is, being lived out in different countries in different ways, and to learn from that. And, at this juncture, I probably should put a period at the end of my sentence because I could go on and on. Well, unfortunately, but listening to you, I can only hear that you've done so many things, and we'd love to talk about all of this. But now I'd like to ask Jody a question. Jody, you are working as a trainer, an educator. You focus on human rights, diversity, and inclusion. So you have a lot of experience from the field as member of the Critical Friends Network. What do we need when it comes to practicing human rights, political education? What do we need to do when, when we're seeing that, right-wing extremism is becoming, unfortunately, normal? How can we, what can we do to be able to continue conducting our education? Well, I could just basically repeat everything that's been said. And I could also play Ibrahim's video as well. I think, empowerment is the most important factor when it comes to those who are marginalized. We want to empower these people to be in the rooms, in all of the settings so that they can do the very important work that they are doing. Now, when it comes to human rights education, political education, democratic education, our project is, with building bridges with human via human rights. And, it's very important for us to, keep into consideration that human rights are the foundation for everything, regardless of whether or not it's democratic, organizational, political, education. Human rights is really the foundation of all of this. So we need to be clear that this is a foundation upon which everything is then built. And this is something that we heard from everybody here today, especially Ibrahim. And this is something that we really need to put a focus on in our education. Another aspect that I'd like to focus on is how can we make it clear to people how important and useful human rights are. This is a very important thing that we need to make clear when it comes to how people, interact with human rights on a daily basis, when it comes to education, right to nutrition, right to food, right to work, right to freedom of movement. We need to make it clear that, these aspects that we deal with on a daily basis are indeed human rights. We see oftentimes human rights as being something separate to, things that take place in one's daily lives, but we need to show people how the things that, or what things they do in their daily lives are indeed human rights. There's another thing that I want to focus on, and this is something that Ibrahim also said, and it means creating a found shared foundation in terms of how can we deal with people that are different from me, what connects us. And I think that human rights play an important role because we are all connected uh, through our differences via human rights. And so this should be seen as a certain responsibility that we all have. We need to enjoy our human rights, perhaps bringing more of an emphasis to the word enjoyment. It's not just about having human rights, it's about everybody being able to enjoy their human rights. And in order to do this, we need to make sure that we have, strong networks, alliances of people helping everybody enjoy the human rights that they, of course, have as a human being. So these are just a few, things that I wanted to point out, focus on. And these are, points that perhaps are not really focused on enough. So yeah, I agree with you that these are things that could be focused on. And thank you very much for sharing that with us. Simona, when we spoke prior to this meeting, or rather this event, that you said that a lot of terms, like the term education is very important, political education important. What do you think needs to be done? What needs to be done to have a inclusive, human rights oriented, decolonial educational setting when it comes to political education work? Well, as you know, a woman with a disability, I perhaps have a different perspective. It's crazy that 2 years have passed, and my task within this project was to take a look at, when we make a video, what are we portraying? If it's a video of of people walking on a street, men, women, what are we seeing? We're not seeing anybody with, who's blind or who is in a wheelchair. And so it's important for me to make sure that we're aware of what we're portraying. We want to also make sure that people are being empowered and enjoying their rights, as Judy said, but these rights only work when we are aware of others' rights. So it's not just about being able to stand up for our own rights, but when we are enjoying human rights, we have the responsibility to make sure that others are enjoying them as well. Now, when it comes to education, and I'm talking about, um, when talking about, people, no, I'm not only talking about people with disabilities, I'm talking about everybody who's marginalized. People need to be aware that place needs to be made for us, for these people. You know, in my work as an activist, I try to bring this to the fore. In the Convention on Human Rights, we're always talking about through human rights or for human rights. And this is something that I noticed in the video was done differently. We need to know more about human rights. Eleanor Roosevelt said that human rights starts behind your own front door. So it's not about going out and, living out human rights outside of my house, but I need to be living those values in my own house as well. So how can I make that a little bit more tangible? So if, you know, one kid says to another kid, "Hey, you're crazy," it's better to then ask that kid, "Why are you so angry? What's making you angry?" As opposed to notice that they're angry, ask them why they're angry. I created this door hanger and it says, "Do you know what the human rights are?" You know, and it's just basically, encouraging children to be aware that, you know, different people, marginalized groups have rights as well. For example, we see issues in schools. Teacher says the script isn't something that could be read. Can somebody read it out loud? And somebody says to this teacher, well, there's people here who can't read it. Well, the teacher should perhaps also be protected because perhaps she didn't know that there was somebody there who couldn't read it. So there needs to be a certain solidarity shown towards the teacher because the teacher might not have been aware that somebody in that round or that group couldn't read because they were blind. But at the same time, the teacher also should maybe consider that maybe there is somebody there and make sure that other opportunities for them to um, understand the content of the script need to be made available to them. So there needs to be a solidarity going in both directions. So before you get angry at the teacher, also consider that the teacher maybe didn't know and be a little bit more gentle with her or him or them. So this is something that I don't think is really being focused on enough. The University of Bielefeld did an interesting study entitled Generation Inconsiderate. And we see that young people have the feeling that their rights are not being represented and that, they're living in a capitalist society where we see exploitation. And so for me, I would like to focus on younger people, and that would be solidarity towards them. This is something I would like to focus on. I'm not sure if I was very clear in what I said. I see some people raising or rather nodding their head, but I could go on and on.
Yes, I think we all heard your message. Thank you very much for that.